Well, hello and welcome back to the Conversation Cabinet. Today we are very, very fortunate to be joined by Sir Vince Cable, ex-leader of the Lib Dems. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. I'm in a very hot house in the middle of the New Forest, which is where my wife lives.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, the heat isn't for the weak. It's been rough, especially when you're at school.
Yeah, it's been a rough few weeks. So, Vince, how do you see at the moment the current state of the Lib Dems? Obviously, you don't have an incredible knowledge of what's going on internally, but from what you can see outside and what the rest of us can see, what's your views on their present leadership, that style of Ed Davey being quite open and outspoken about current foreign issues like Israel-Gaza war and stuff like that, or in areas like climate change? Do you think what they're doing is correct for the next general election, or do you think they should be doing something quite different?
Well, I'm not actively involved on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I now do academic stuff at the LSE and I'm running businesses, but I'm not involved in politics. So I'm probably no less than you do, actually. But as somebody who used to be a leader of the party, and I'm very pleased with where they've got to. We were in a very difficult position under the first-past-the-post system. We used to have a substantial share of public opinion, but it was never translated into seats in Parliament. But they've cracked that. They've learned how to work with the system, concentrating all our campaigning energies on seats that we had a good chance of winning, mobilising tactical voters, a group of voters who are sort of aligned with Lib Dem ways of thinking about the world. So we've now got over 70 MPs. We've never been in this position since arguably the Liberals back in the 1920s and before, which is a remarkable achievement. And to the extent that Ed Davey has led that, he gets quite a lot of the credit for it. In terms of policy positions, I'm reasonably comfortable with what's happening. He's concentrated on one or two issues that resonate with the kind of people who want to vote for us. Care as a complement to healthcare, pollution by the water companies, which generally makes people angry, and taking what you could call a progressive position, being very critical of Trump, trying to get us away from being a vassal state of the United States, which is absolutely right. Obviously, you've got to be careful with the Gaza issue because people jump on you from both sides if you get that slightly wrong. But taking a principled position seems to me to be fundamentally right.
You said obviously about the Thames water issues, where people are quite unhappy with that. And you were my ex-NP when you were leader. How did you deal with Thames water in that time? Was it quite difficult?
Well, it was strange. The issue which concerned people in Twickenham, or at least one corner of Twickenham, was the smells from the sewage plant. So over a period of years, I campaigned, I had debates in Parliament, focusing on how to cover the plant, and I think I helped persuade them to invest either 50 million or something of that order in reducing smell emissions. At the time when I was doing this campaigning, people were much less aware of the discharges into the river, and this is what's the issue has become subsequently. But what we were aware of was the shocking way in which the company was run. I mean, essentially, they were basically just ripping off the enterprise and the public ultimately by, in a sense, borrowing very heavily, loading the company with debt, and taking out very large shareholder dividends. And that was not how the utilities are supposed to work. But the company that was behind it, which was an Australian bank called Macquarie, sold out on some years ago. It's now acquired, I think, Southern Water. And they behaved in a very predatory way. And it illuminated, I think, the enormous gap in public policy when it comes to regulating water utilities.
Well, back to kind of national politics. With the Lib Dems, obviously immense success in 2024. What do you think that the Lib Dem Party should do to maintain this level of public trust and appeal to swing voters to further enhance their growth?
Well, to some extent, the future of British politics isn't in our hands. I mean, the big battle that's going on behind the scenes, which will determine how we and other political parties operate in future, is the struggle for the right. It's not at all clear that the Conservative Party is going to survive in its present form, and that has a major influence on the Lib Dems, because almost all the seats that the Lib Dems have in Parliament were in Conservative-facing areas. In other words, we defeated Conservatives, often with the help of a lot of Labour-inclined voters. So if the Conservative Party disappears or is very badly damaged, it's currently, I think, below 20% in terms of public support, then that greatly affects the campaigning and the tactics we adopt in future. One scenario, which is possible, is that the Conservatives are simply replaced by the Reform Party, either because Reform outvote them in the elections, local, national, by-elections, or by taking it over from within. I mean, a kind of reverse takeover, and either of those is possible. And if that happens, the Lib Dems will then be faced with a party that is very illiberal, that jars very badly with the values of a lot of the kind of educated middle class voters who live in the kind of seats that the Lib Dems represents. And that's, I think, the challenge for us in those circumstances is to retain our appeal to what you might call moderate one nation conservatives. And the tricky thing for the leadership is then how to do that while at the same time being a credible, loosely centre-left party with a strong belief in public services, a degree of redistribution of taxes. It's a real dilemma. I say I'm not in there debating these things, but if I was looking ahead in the party 4 or 5 years, that's the kind of problem that I would face. In one sense, it's good news. I mean, if the Conservative Party disappears, then your main adversary's disappeared, but you're then dealing with an alternative which is populist and very ugly and is appealing to some pretty nasty prejudices, and which have got to be countered with liberal values.
It's interesting you mentioned obviously the downfall of the Conservatives recently when you were obviously in coalition. You were part of the cabinet when the Lib Dems were in coalition with the Conservatives. Did you ever see this coming?
Yes, I mean, I was the deputy leader of the Lib Dems at the time, and yeah, I had one of the most powerful positions in the cabinet, so I saw everything at very close quarters.
So did you see any of this coming from that position, that the Conservatives would, I don't know, have this fall off?
No, absolutely not, because the Cameron era was an era of great Conservative confidence. I mean, arguably, we were, thoroughly stuffed by them, which is why we did badly in the 2015 election. And they were completely ruthless, very confident, and they took all the credit for the good things the coalition government was doing. We got blamed for some of the bad things. They were then a very, very powerful organisation. So the idea that they would fall apart was something that didn't really cross our mind. The storm that was coming over the horizon, of course, was the Brexit referendum. We told Cameron when we were in government that the whole idea was very bad. He shouldn't pursue it. There was a real risk of losing it, and merely having a referendum on the European Union at that time was destabilising our relationship with Europe. Well, they did have it. They lost it, and it's had major long-term consequences for the Conservative Party. It's unleashed a whole lot of political forces that they've been unable to control.
Could you just give us a bit more kind of insight to what it was like in the cabinet? Because there must have been lots of clashes, to say the least.
Well, it was actually a very good government, and most people who were around at the time as commentators or civil servants, they now look back on it fairly nostalgically, because instead of this sort of day-to-day dramas, we had a 5-year government. It had a very clear plan. It had a very clear set of objectives. We constantly disagreed about things, but we had a mechanism for arguing them out, coming to conclusions, and then implementing them. So the coalition government passed numerous bits of legislation, many of them instigated by the Lib Dems, very positive action on all kinds of front, things like the pupil premium in education, all the kind of stuff that was going on under my leadership in my department, the industrial strategy, the setting up of the business bank, the setting up of the catapult network for innovation, and a whole lot of stuff around labour relations, making workers' rights in a market-friendly and sensible way, which we were able to get through largely because we were negotiating in a very structured and practical way. So it was a very successful experience, despite the fact that there were some very bad episodes. From a purely personal point of view, it was very intense. You're under pressure the whole time. I ultimately lost my seat at the end of it, though I was stuck around and was able to win it back again. But it was certainly it was the best period of my political life, and I've emerged from it feeling I'd achieved a good deal, and many of the things I introduced in government are still there.
You talked about the impact of the Brexit referendum and how it's negatively impacted us since, and that's, you could argue, brought in quite significant fragmentation into the UK party system and politics as a whole. Do you view this as a strategic moment for Lib Dems to introduce a system like proportional representation or something similar?
Well, there are two aspects to that. From the Lib Dems have long argued that the British political system was designed for two parties, not for three. We now got five, if you include the Greens. The first past the post system with five parties, usually four, produces some ridiculous outcomes because you can get elected with little over 25% of the vote, people who are totally unrepresentative. And it could produce, wildly unrepresentative outcomes. This current government has got an enormous majority with just over 30% of the vote. You can envisage Mr. Farage winning a landslide with just over 30% of the vote. This is a very, very bad destabilizing political environment. So in the national interest, we do need to have a voting system that is more representative, and we've suggested in the past mechanisms for doing it. That's not a problem. They're already, you get this in Scotland for their parliamentary elections and local elections. There's no great difficulty technically in doing it. It's just having the political will to do it. And we hope that this Labour government will see that it's in its self-interest to do electoral reform rather than something just to please the Lib Dems and the Greens. The other part of the question related to Europe. As it happens, one of my roles now is to be a patron and vice president of the European movement. I don't think there's any prospects of rejoining the European Union tomorrow or even next year, but by sensible campaigning and negotiation, we can recreate many of the features of the customs union and the single market, which are necessary for Britain's long-term economic interests. And that's actually something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about and working on.
Given your extensive tenure as obviously the business secretary, as you mentioned earlier, and your work on economic resilience, what lessons from 2008 to 2016 would you say today's Lib Dems carry forward, especially in the light of the cost of living pressures, etc.? Because obviously you called out the 2008 crisis before it happened, or so I've read, which is insane.
Well, yes, I did, but I wouldn't claim that I understood everything that was going on. It was a global crisis, and many of the problems happened in the United States. And I certainly wasn't across that, but it did seem to me that what was dangerous in the UK were two things. First of all, was the behaviour of the banks that were behaving in a demonstrably reckless way, which I kept pointing out. And the second was the housing market. That the banks were lending on multiples of income or considerably more than the value of the property that people were taking mortgages against, which was very unstable. And we could see at some point it was going to come to a shuddering halt, which it did. So I got some credit for that. I mean, it's a highly relevant issue because if you'd followed the Mansion House speech yesterday, the government is pushing the boundaries of risk and stability. I mean, it may be this time round we're better cushioned, but one of the really big reforms that I brought in as a minister with the support from Osborne was the ring fencing of banks to keep their deposits separate from the activities of the investment banks, which involve, putting it crudely, a kind of gambling. And there's some indication that this government are trying to relax the set of rules around that, which are potentially very dangerous. And the other is that Rachel Reeves yesterday was pushing the idea of making it easier for people to borrow 4.5 times their income. I mean, this is really straining at the limits, as well as bidding up the demand for housing without increasing supply, which, of course, prices other people out of the market. So there are some lessons from that period before 2010, which was, of course, a Labour government, and overlooked the elements of instability at the time, that they're in danger of repeating them. So I would want to be very careful about financial stability, more careful than is the case. But in terms of management of cost of living, inflation, the Lib Dems fully supported the reforms in 2010 to make the Bank of England independent and with an inflation mandate, and that should continue to be supported. That we shouldn't be chasing after short-term popularity. You need basic discipline around monetary policy and fiscal policy, and that should remain a centrepiece of what the Lib Dems are saying.
You were also, as your time when you were for the Minister of the Digital Economy, you made it very clear about the importance of data security, and we're living in a time now where artificial intelligence is almost used by everyone, and it's becoming there's increased fears surrounding its security in your conversations and what you're sharing with it. So these initiatives are also obviously very relevant now. But do you think the party should have a very clear digital infrastructure so that people can, be more can understand more easily what the party's direction is moving forward?
Yes, I'm not sure, to be quite frank, what our position is on that. It's not, in many ways, not a party political issue. I don't also claim to be an expert in this field. What I did do when I was Secretary of State, I think it was the last speech I gave. I never imagined how this was going to turn out, but I went to Brussels to give the annual Schuman lecture, and the purpose of the speech was to argue for a digital single market in Europe. Well, of course, I mean, you know what happened. A year later, we'd left the European Union, so that whole initiative disappeared. And the other thing which I did, which has got relevance today, was to bring in legislation to strengthen copyright, which has become very topical because, of course, one of the things which happens with streaming and Spotify and other platforms is that, there is a danger of undermining the rights of people who create content, filmmakers, photographers, people in the creative industries. And so I tried to strengthen the law and did do so, actually, to protect their interests. And there is a big campaign on at the moment by the big the big platforms, Google and all the rest of it, to undermine creators' rights, and that seems to me a very big issue. If I were around politically active at the moment, I think the kind of issues I would want to concentrate on were working with the European Commission, which has been much tougher on the big oligopolies, the Meta, Google, the rest of them, which have massive monopolies. They buy up competitors, and you really do need to enforce tough competition policy. Of course, the Trump administration absolutely hates that stuff. So that is one of the big arguments, actually, for maintaining our independence vis-a-vis the United States. One of the things that Britain did, and there was the Conservatives under Philip Hammond who did this, was to tax the big digital enterprises. I think it's only a 3% of their revenue, but it does mean that they pay some tax. Absolutely outrageous that Amazon was paying very little tax in the UK, but all its small trading competitors were paying through the nose because they've got bricks and mortar businesses. So digital taxation is a very important principle. In terms of this balance between so-called free speech in a digital environment and protection, I strongly support the legislation that's brought in the UK recently to protect users, particularly from child abuse and some of the appalling things that are getting through into the internet. So I think a protection regime is very important, and you've got to see off these so-called free speech absolutists like Elon Musk. So there's quite a big package of things there, but I would like Lib Dems to be very much at the forefront of giving leadership in the digital world, and certainly for your generation. Having a party that takes a clear lead on these things is doubly important.
No, definitely, it's certainly scary to see the development of these, as you say, these massive oligopolies and huge companies and the power they have, and just and the influence over young people. No, it's very important. Well, we have one last question for you, Vince. So looking back throughout your career, obviously you saw many critical moments politically, like Cold War politics, through financial crisis to Brexit. How did your knowledge of these systemic shocks kind of inform your leadership on your decision making when you were leading the Lib Dem Party?
Well, I think the honest answer is probably not very much, because the whole of the period when I was leader, as I was leader for 2 years, was totally dominated by the Brexit issue. Parliament had voted to embed the results of the referendum, but in a form that was very unpalatable. I mean, it wasn't just about leading the European Union, but it was leading all the key economic pillars of Europe, which we believe wasn't necessary. So I was part of the People's Vote campaign. We didn't succeed eventually, but we mobilized millions of people to argue for it. And I think the Lib Dems should now continue as the party for Europe. I think people have seen that Brexit was, in many ways, a failure even in its own terms. And we can't just sit here and say, well, it was a bad thing, but nothing we can do about it. And there are things you can do about it. And rebuilding our relations with the European Union seems an important part of it. And in my case, the personal angle to this is that I'm sufficiently long in the tooth that I was around the original referendum, which was in the 1970s, long before you were born. So I've been with this for half a century, and it's formed a fairly solid view of the world. But the other aspect to it is that I'd spent most of my life before I became an MP in a variety of international roles. I worked in Africa, travelled in Latin America, did a lot of work on India. It's about understanding the way in which the world economy has shifted away from the West, Europe and the United States, towards the so-called global South, and especially Asia, especially China and India. I've just written a book which appears in a few weeks' time called The Eclipsing of the West. And one of my big messages for British politics is that, we've just got to get used to the idea that economic power now resides somewhere else. Europe has got to be cohesive so that we can deal with a rising China and India and the other important powers, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others. But we've got to deal with it recognizing that we no longer hold all the cards, to use Trump's expression. So if I were back in politics, that would be one of the big themes that I would be making.
Well, Vince, thank you very much for your incredible insight. It's been amazing to listen to, so thank you very much. But that's all we have time for today.
Thank you.